It is Friday, November 22nd, and here at Love Field in Dallas, Texas, a large crowd is on hand for the arrival of President Kennedy. High overhead in the clear Texas sky, the big blue and white jet known as Air Force One, with John Fitzgerald Kennedy and his traveling party aboard, is making final preparations to land. Earlier stops on this trip have taken Mr. Kennedy to San Antonio, Houston, and Fort Worth. Later today, he is scheduled to go on to Austin, and finally to the LBJ Ranch near Austin for the night. It is now 11:37 a.m. Air Force One has landed, and as President Kennedy steps out, the huge throng of people at Love Field this day push and strain to gain some vantage point from which they might catch a better glimpse of the President of the United States. President and Mrs. Kennedy appear to be in good spirits as they walk toward the crowd. It's a festive occasion, but much to the concern of his Secret Service bodyguards, President Kennedy, placing the political demands of his office above personal safety, obliges the crowd by walking the length of the fence which holds them back, shaking hands and chatting informally. After 8 to 10 minutes of handshaking, President and Mrs. Kennedy, joined by Texas Governor and Mrs. Connolly, enter the waiting limousine and begin the drive through Dallas to the Trade Mart building, where a luncheon speech is scheduled for 12:30. It is a clear, cool day. The skies have cleared after an overnight shower, and the temperature is moderate for Texas in November. Crowds of people line the streets all along the route of the motorcade through the city. Down Main Street in Dallas, the motorcade proceeds through the man-made canyon of tall buildings until it reaches Houston Street, where it makes a right turn. Ahead, 1 block, at the corner of Houston and Elm, looms a large red brick building, the Texas School Book Depository. And from this 6th-floor window, an assassin looks out and lies in wait to fulfill his appointment with history. The motorcade makes one final turn, left this time onto Elm and in front of the Texas School Book Depository building. It will be but a short distance down Elm to Stemmons Expressway and then on to the Trade Mart. It is now 12:30 p.m., and as President Kennedy waves to the crowd, shots ring out. The first of the assassin's bullets strikes him high in the back and emerges from his neck. As his hands rise instinctively to grasp at the wound, another and this time fatal shot strikes him in the head. Governor Connolly is also struck by one of the assassin's shots, and although seriously injured, will live to recall his close brush with death. The well-trained Secret Service men react almost automatically in an effort to protect the President, and the President's limousine rapidly gains speed as it races down Elm toward the Triple Underpass and then Stemmons Expressway for the short ride to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Inside the emergency room at Parkland Hospital, the scene is tense as the doctors work desperately over the body of President Kennedy. But it is to no avail. And a waiting nation hears the word at 1:33 p.m. Central Standard Time, Friday, November 22nd, 1963. The President of the United States is dead. These last few minutes in the life of President John Kennedy should be known by every person in America. For millions of words, thousands of articles, and hundreds of books have been written about that tragic day in Dallas. But still, the most important question remains unanswered to the satisfaction of most Americans. Was the murder of President Kennedy the result of a well-planned and successfully carried out conspiracy, or was this brutal act of violence the work of one sick, mentally deranged madman? The lives of John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald were different in almost every respect, but their separate paths through this life merged during that brief but violent moment in Dallas. This meeting of destinies was shortly to become even more fantastic when on Sunday, November 24th, in full view of a nationwide television audience, Jack Ruby, a third-rate hoodlum and Dallas nightclub owner, shot and killed Oswald, effectively sealing forever the lips of the president's assassin. Even the most vocal critics of President Kennedy were stunned by his murder in Dallas. Americans everywhere, after recovering from the shock, began demanding full investigation into the circumstances surrounding his death. A similar demand also came from the communist periodical The Worker, but instead of calling for an open investigation, this lead article of the November 26 issue demanded a controlled investigation by a selected few. The communists called for an extraordinary commission, as they phrased it, to be hand-selected by the president. This communist publication even went so far as to state that Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, was their choice to head this extraordinary commission. 3 days later, on November 29, President Johnson announced the formation of just such an investigating committee to be composed of 7 men, headed by Earl Warren, and no other investigations were to be permitted. Thus was born the Warren Commission. Anyone with the time and stamina to struggle through the 27 volumes of testimony and conclusions of the Warren Report will surely be left with the feeling that many things are still unknown. John Fitzgerald Kennedy lived his life under the glare of the spotlight that shines on those of great wealth and in national politics. It is not our purpose here to evaluate his career, for we are still too close to the emotional impact of his sudden and violent death. Such an evaluation shall remain the task of future generations and future historians, who themselves were not personally caught up in the drama. But it is possible today to arrive at objective conclusions regarding Lee Harvey Oswald, for the basic facts surrounding his life and career are beyond the realm of dispute. He was born in New Orleans on October 18, 1939, and was but 24 years old when he murdered President Kennedy in Dallas. He claimed that the writings of Karl Marx had first interested him in communism at the age of 15, hardly an age when one would be expected to have the experience and maturity to effectively analyze and evaluate communist dogma and propaganda. Oswald joined the United States Marines in October 1956 at the age of 17. During his almost 3 years of service, he gained the reputation of being a troublemaker, for he consistently failed to live up to the standards set by the Marine Corps. He was released from active duty in September 1959, and while still in the Marine Reserves, defected to Communist Russia, arriving there on October 13, 1959. Just 18 days after his arrival in Russia, Oswald appeared at the American Embassy in Moscow and presented this scrawling, handwritten note in which he affirmed that his allegiance was to Russia. The note also stated, "I, Lee Harvey Oswald, do hereby request that my present citizenship in the United States of America be revoked." Why this demand was not granted has never been explained by embassy officials, but this failure certainly proved to be convenient later when Oswald was ready to return to America. Oswald's life in Communist Russia is most interesting, for he seems to have been granted many special privileges almost impossible to obtain even by citizens of Russia. While most foreigners must secure permission to travel even short distances by bus or train, Oswald was permitted to travel freely inside the Soviet Union. Someone in Russia vouched for his identity card, and someone got him a work permit. Such documents are necessary in Communist Russia. The Soviet Employment Service secured him a job, and in addition to his salary, he received a monthly allowance from the Soviet government. Lee Harvey Oswald was permitted to marry a Russian girl, Marina Prusakova, whose uncle was a colonel in the Soviet secret police. And when the time came for Oswald to return to the United States, Soviet officials permitted him to take his Russian wife and their infant child with him. Despite Oswald's defection to Russia, his constant condemnations of the American system, his denouncement of his American citizenship, and his pledge of allegiance to Communist Russia, American embassy officials in Moscow advanced him over $400 of U.S. taxpayers' funds to help him with the fare for him and his family on their return to America in June 1962. Oswald found employment first in Fort Worth and then in Dallas. He moved to New Orleans in April 1963, but again returned to Dallas in October. All during this period of transient activity, he continued to show his support of communism by maintaining contacts with the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a notorious propaganda front for Fidel Castro. He became chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans, appeared as its spokesman on radio, and is shown here distributing this communist group's Hate America literature. In March, shortly before he moved to New Orleans under his frequently used alias of Mr. A. Hidell, he purchased this 6.5 millimeter Italian-made rifle, with which later he was to murder the president. At about the same time, and under the same alias, he purchased the .38 caliber pistol with which he shot and killed Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit. On October 15th, barely 2 weeks after a mysterious trip to Mexico City, where he visited both the Russian and the Cuban embassies, he found new employment in Dallas, this time at the Texas School Book Depository building. The stage setting was now complete for Oswald's act of violence. Was it careful planning and manipulation, or just an incredible compounding of coincidences which placed this particular person at this particular vantage point on this particular day? Perhaps we shall never know. But Oswald's action after the assassination certainly show a pattern of planning and calm execution. After firing the fatal shots, he apparently walked down the stairs after having taken the precaution of stopping all the elevators at the top floor. He was stopped on the second floor by a police officer, but he was released when the building manager vouched that he worked in the building. On leaving the book depository building, Oswald walked up Elm Street to Murphy Street, and there he boarded a bus. The bus headed back down Elm toward the assassination site, but was unable to make headway in the massive traffic jam. So Oswald left the bus on Elm Street between Poydras and Lamar. He then walked south on Lamar for 2 blocks to the corner of Commerce, and there he entered a cab driven by William W. Whaley. The cab driver was able to bypass the major traffic tie-up and drove Oswald to the intersection of Beckley and Neely. Here Oswald left the cab and walked the short distance back to his room on North Beckley Avenue. Oswald had rented his room here at 1026 North Beckley under the name of O.H. Lee. And now, once inside, he wasted little time in changing jackets, getting his .38 caliber pistol, and departing. Oswald must have known that by now his 6th floor hiding place would have been found, his absence from the school book depository building discovered, and that it would be just a matter of time before the police would be searching for him. Where was Oswald going when he left his room on that November afternoon? Since his capture was inevitable, was he going to some unknown meeting place to complete a prearranged escape plan? We can only speculate as to the answer, for shortly after leaving his room on Beckley Avenue, any plans for escape that Oswald might have had were changed dramatically and tragically by Officer J.D. Tippit. It was on 10th Street at the corner of Patton where Officer Tippit stopped Lee Harvey Oswald. We shall never know exactly why. Maybe Oswald was acting in a suspicious manner, or possibly Officer Tippit had heard the description of Oswald that was already being broadcast by police radio. But it was here on this tree-shaded street that Officer Tippit met his death at the hands of Lee Harvey Oswald. Following the murder of this Dallas policeman, Oswald discarded his jacket a short distance away, and then walked down Jefferson Street to the Texas Theater. He went into the theater, and it was here that he was apprehended by police officers a few minutes later. Shortly after his arrest, Oswald showed typical communist arrogance by proudly displaying the International Communist Clench Fist Salute. On Saturday, Oswald began demanding to see his lawyer, and his choice of attorneys is significant, for he called for John J. Apt, an identified communist living in New York. But here Oswald received a basic lesson in advanced communist strategy, for Mr. Apt was unreachable. Lee Harvey Oswald was caught in such a tight web of incriminating evidence that evidently he was too hot for even the communist lawyers to handle. Oswald called for John Apt on Saturday the 23rd, and it was less than 24 hours later, the next morning at 11:20 a.m., that he was shot and silenced by Jack Ruby while being transferred from the City Hall jail to the county jail. Oswald was rushed to Parkland Hospital, but 1.5 hours later he died, ironically in the same hospital emergency room where John Fitzgerald Kennedy had been taken just 2 days before. Oswald was now silenced forever. His death did not end the questions that were becoming more penetrating as the hours passed, but it very effectively ended the possibility that he might reveal the answers that could have proven whether or not a conspiracy existed, and if so, who was involved with Oswald. So many pieces are still missing in the background of Jack Ruby that he has become in many ways the real mystery man of the Kennedy assassination. Following the spectacular shooting of Oswald, Ruby was apprehended immediately by police officers. He was charged with the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald, and though he pleaded not guilty, was convicted and sentenced to die in the electric chair. His trial was a continuing series of headline-grabbing statements and events, and his appeal from the murder conviction was still pending when he died in January 1967. Throughout his long period in custody, he steadfastly maintained that he had not known Oswald, and that his motive for the slaying was to spare Mrs. Kennedy the ordeal of a public trial for her husband's slayer. No conclusive evidence has been brought to light to indicate that Ruby was connected with the assassination, but a number of interesting items in his past point to the possibility that he could have been carrying out orders when he silenced Oswald. It is known that Jack Ruby was born in 1911 in Chicago as Jacob Rubenstein. He had one older brother, Hyman, 3 older sisters, Anne, Marion, and Eva, 2 younger brothers, Sam and Earl, and 1 younger sister, Eileen. Here we get a glimpse at another one of those coincidences which regularly occur throughout the entire assassination affair. Former Congressman Martin Dies of Texas served 7 years as chairman of the Historic Dies Committee, the first congressional committee to investigate subversive activities in the United States. In this article titled Assassination and Its Aftermath, which appeared in the March 1964 issue of American Opinion magazine, Congressman Dies pointed out that his committee's records had established that in 1929 a Jack Rubenstein was on the executive board of the Young Communist League in the United States. This is a communist organization for communists under the age of 21. And in 1929, the Jack or Jacob Rubenstein, who was later to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald, was 18 years old. Congressman Dies also pointed out that these same committee hearings mention an H. Rubenstein and a Dr. Annette Rubenstein. This Jack Rubenstein, H. Rubenstein, and Dr. Annette Rubenstein could certainly be different persons from the Jack Rubenstein, Hyman Rubenstein, and Anne Rubenstein we are discussing. But the important point is, we may never be able to find out. For even though this information was made public barely 3 months after the assassination, incredibly, the Warren Commission chose to ignore it. Or is it possible that this was investigated and remains that part of the record which Justice Warren has told us will not be made public in our lifetime? Either answer should be totally unacceptable to the American people. As an adult, Jack Ruby lived most of his life on the very edge of the law, but he seems to have stayed clear of associations with communists until his dramatic rendezvous with Oswald on November 24th. Ruby has now joined John Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald in death, but this should not stop continuing inquiry into his motive for killing Oswald. If we are to seriously consider the possibility that Oswald was following orders when he murdered John Kennedy, we must examine the question of motive and possible gains for those who gave the orders. Lee Harvey Oswald admitted that he was a Marxist communist, and all the known facts support that conclusion. So let us at least tentatively approach the question of gains from the point of view of the communist enemies of America. Through outright communist and pro-communist periodicals such as The Worker, The People's World, The National Guardian, Political Affairs, and others, communists in this country have publicly endorsed the legislation and programs of which they approve. We will not speculate as to their motives, but an examination of the public record of both John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson will show clearly and indisputably that during their years in public office they have worked for, voted for, spoken in favor of, and supported a large number of government-directed programs that have long been favored also by the communists in this country. It could be reasonably assumed that should Lyndon Johnson replace John Kennedy as president, there would be no major changes in the administration of the executive branch of our government. In fact, a significant gain for the communists could be realized as a result of such a change in leadership. President Kennedy had not been too effective in his efforts to get those programs he favored through a Congress that at times showed a surprising amount of independence. But Lyndon Johnson, being more experienced in the legislative game of give and take, could be expected to get far more of the new frontier programs enacted by Congress. The flood of legislation favored by John Kennedy, but enacted into law after Lyndon Johnson became president, certainly shows that Mr. Johnson has been more talented and effective in his ability to handle the Congress of the United States. John Kennedy had been elected to the presidency in 1960 by the slimmest margin in recent history. During his almost 3 years in the presidency, many of his actions had upset a large number of Americans, and his popularity had declined considerably. Even those opinion polls most favorable to him personally showed that there was serious doubt as to his ability to win re-election in 1964, especially if opposed by a candidate offering clear-cut alternatives. In contrast, should Lyndon Johnson replace John Kennedy and be a candidate for re-election, he would benefit from President Kennedy's popularity with a segment of the American people, yet not suffer from President Kennedy's unpopularity with others. The overwhelming Johnson victory in 1964 certainly shows this to be an accurate evaluation of the situation. The new frontiersmen were re-elected by the greatest margin in history, and thus were able to continue their programs. There is a third major benefit which the communists could logically expect to reap by the assassination of President Kennedy. Since John Kennedy was what is usually called a liberal, the immediate suspects, if he were assassinated, would be the conservatives or right-wingers. Hardly had the shooting in Dallas ended that terrible Friday before spokesmen for the left, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, began condemning Dallas as a city of hate and as a center for rightist activities. It is extremely doubtful if the deluge of unfounded charges and insinuations would have ended even now, but for the obviously unexpected capture of Oswald. It is even conceivable that had Oswald not been apprehended, the American people, stirred into hysterical rage, would have condoned the arrest and incarceration of the more prominent conservative critics of President Kennedy's policies. John Kennedy was the 4th American president to die at the hands of an assassin in less than 100 years. Before him were William McKinley, James Garfield, and Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln was shot on the evening of April 14, 1865, and died the next morning. On that fateful evening, he was attending a play in Ford's Theater when John Wilkes Booth walked into the president's box and fired the fatal shot. Booth obviously wanted to be known as Lincoln's assassin, for after the shooting, he leaped onto the stage of Ford's Theater and proclaimed his deed before making his escape. James Garfield was shot by Charles J. Guiteau at a Washington, D.C. train station on the morning of July 2, 1881, and died on September 19. His assassin also must have wanted the notoriety for his act, for he carried out his attack under circumstances where escape after the shooting was inconceivable. William McKinley was shot by Leon F. Chalgosh on September 6, 1901, during a brief reception for the public in Buffalo, New York. He died on September 14. And again, the assassin obviously had no thought of escape, for the circumstances under which the murder occurred precluded any such possibility. But Oswald's murder of President Kennedy differs considerably, for he behaved in such a way to give every indication that he had not anticipated being captured. The Communists continue to drive unceasingly toward their goal of world domination. The victims of their ruthlessness are numbered in the hundreds of millions, and among those victims is now included a President of the United States struck down on the streets of America. The President of the United States was murdered by a communist, and his assassin was then silenced before any conspirators could be revealed. But still, most of the American people sit by, apparently unaware of or indifferent to the communist-inspired violence that surrounds them. Oswald's murder of John Kennedy was a violation of the laws of the sovereign state of Texas, and the proper authorities in that state should conduct a thorough investigation to uncover any accomplices that should be brought to justice. And the Congress, as representatives of the American people, should conduct their own independent investigation because of the subversive aspect, to uncover the enemies of freedom who still continue their efforts to destroy America. But only the aroused voice of the American people can force these inquiries to be held and the whole truth revealed. The question is, will the American people make their voice heard by those who hold public office, or will they continue to sit in silence?